Hi folks, welcome to our series of how to talk with your child about race. This is part 3 of a 3-part series. So we are concluding our conversations today as we gather. Let's start with our why. We're going to look back to our very first part, and this is the most important thing. Why do we talk with our children about race? Because we are followers of Jesus. Jesus valued everyone because we are all made in God's image. And Jesus was with those who were hurting and those who were marginalized. And therefore, we as followers of Christ need to be with our friends of color, our brothers and sisters of color, as they are hurting in their communities. We need to care, we need to listen, and we need to walk alongside. And therefore, we need to be talking to our children about how we might do that. So I want to ask you a question that someone asked me recently that stopped me in my tracks. Here's the question. When did you first realize your race? Okay, so for me, when did I first realize that I was white? Now, if you are a friend of color, when did you first realize that you were black? When did you first realize that you were brown? I bet that your answer is not 3rd grade like my answer. I bet that our friends of color had to realize that they were in situations where they didn't look like everybody else a lot sooner than I did. Now, I went to an elementary school with children of all colors and a lot of children of all colors, but I didn't actually have to stop and realize, oh, I'm white, until I was in the 3rd grade. So if you stop and think about that question, because that's an uncomfortable question, if you stop and think about that question, and when you realize that you were whatever race you are, that's an important conversation to have with your child. When did your child realize that they were white or brown or black? It can spark some great conversation from there about, well, I wonder why. Okay, so I'm going to take this conversation a little further. When I was in adoption class a couple of years ago, I did an activity and I wanted to sort of share it with you today. So I've got my jar and I've got Legos because I don't have any beads at my house. But when I did this last time, we had different colored beads. And so they asked us questions like, okay, put a blue Lego in for this race, and put a yellow Lego in for this race, and put a green Lego in for this race. And so you had your sort of key of how you wanted to do it. And then, okay, so if your doctor put a bead in or a Lego in for what race your doctor is, and put a Lego in for what race your dentist is and your hygienist. Put a bead in for what restaurants you go to with folks that serve you there. And so you can put in maybe 3 for those. And then put a bead in for what race your church, for the most part, is, and your neighborhood, and your school, and your work. And so then when you finish, you have whatever colors are predominant that you spend time around with that race. Now, I have to tell you that when I did this activity, there was a little variety in my jar, but not very much. So I think if we stop and think this way, and maybe even do this activity with our children, we can think about who we spend time with and how we might widen our circle so that we might spend time with people who don't look like us. Because it's easy to go through a day and kind of live in this little circle. So let's think about how we can intentionally widen it. Maybe shopping at Black-owned businesses. Maybe it's choosing a pediatrician that is of color. Maybe it is making a point to get to know the friends that your child has at school. Those are different ways that we can widen our circle, that we can be intentional about who we spend time with. Okay, now I want to share one more thing that I feel like is really uncomfortable. And I've been wrestling about how to process this. So back in November, I did a Racial Equity Institute, and I'll put that in the comments so you can look this up, a 2-day course on racial equity and trying to understand the scope of the racial challenges that we have in our nation. And one of the things that they shared was that the superintendent of one of the counties that's pretty local here had a list of all of the vendors that the school system used. And she saw this certain label in this category, but a lot of blanks in that same category. And so she realized that this label said that this is a Black vendor. And then all the other spots were blank. And she asked the question, well, why are these other spots blank? Well, what they got to the bottom of it to discover was that the vendors that were blank, they were white-owned businesses. So we live in this world, or at least I live in this world, where my normal is white, where everything looks the same. And so if we stop and think about it, we realize that we don't name whiteness. And by not naming whiteness, then that's our normal. And when we name Blackness or brownness, our Latino friends, then we are saying that they are different, that they are other. Now to hear that, I processed that and I was trying to make sense of it, and it kind of hurt deeply. And I went, well, no, it's not that bad. But the more I've sat with that, the more I've realized, no, we really are in this white is normal society. So I invite you to sit with that, to think about it. And then here's something I've also realized that I've done in my life, if I'm talking about somebody that is of color, and I'm telling a story about them, a family, a business owner, a person I see, whatever, I'm telling the story, and if they're a person of color, I say, and they're Black. So I name that they're Black. I name that they're of color. But I don't name my white friends, oh, my white friend over there, right? And so, we continue that, the normalcy of everything is white, and if you're not white, you're different. So what if, and this is tricky, and I'm gonna have a hard time doing this myself, but something that I want to try with me and my family is to start naming whiteness. So if we go into a store that's white owned, I'll name it. And if we are talking about some white friends, I'm gonna name it. And that's hard to do. I'm kind of overwhelmed by the idea of it. But I also know that if we name it, then we're gonna start to hear it differently and notice, oh, well, I've said white a lot lately. So maybe I need to broaden my horizons. Maybe I need to look a little further and be a little more intentional. So we've been talking lately about not being racist and paying attention to our explicit and implicit bias and being able to start changing the narrative. If we're talking about it, if we're noticing it, then we can help train ourselves to learn something new. So then there's not racist versus anti-racist. And this is the really hard part, the part that we're trying to figure out because it's such a big system. So being anti-racist is learning about the systemic racism in our society and the laws and rules and procedures and policies that have been put in place that have favored white people. So the trick about that is it's going to take a lot more learning. But I think we can talk to our kids about it and say, just like we've been watching all of this unfold about the police, about how we need to be training differently, how we need to be paying attention differently, and how we need to be caring differently. We can talk to our children about education. We can talk to our children about the justice system. We can talk to our children about health care. We can talk to our children just about so many different ways and systems that are out there that favor white people. So I encourage you to talk to your children about that, but say things like, well, we need to help change the policy. And so in that, I think we need to be learning. Parents, we need to be learning ourselves. And so here are a couple of ways that I invite you to be learning. So I went in November to the Racial Equity Institute, like I just said to you earlier, and did their 2-day training to understand more about racial equity in our country. So I would invite you to look into REI, Racial Equity Institute. And so I'm going to put their information in the comments so that you can learn more and so that you might be able to sign up for one of their workshops. It was very informative. It's a lot to sit with. Now, I learned about Racial Equity Institute through Neighbors for Better Neighborhoods. And that's right here locally in Winston-Salem. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do lately in educating myself, because that really helps us continue the conversation with our children, is every Tuesday at 12:30, they bring people in to have conversation about community help, about what different systems that they are looking at, the different ways that, that really can educate us about what's happening in our community for people of color. So I invite you to check out Neighbors for Better Neighborhoods, and I'll put that in the comments as well as please follow them on Facebook. I think they're really informative. I have learned a lot, and it has allowed me to have more conversation with my spouse and with my children. Okay, so now I've just got a couple of resources that I want to share with you. You know, we've talked about books, and we've talked about books that are specific to talking about race and discrimination. And so I'm actually going to share with you a website. It's 37 children's books about race and discrimination, and it's from colorsofus.com. It's a British spelling of colors, C-O-L-O-U-R-S, and I will share that with you. But the other thing that I love about this website is that it also gives you reading lists for African Americans, reading lists for Hispanics, that's the terminology that they use, and different toys that you can purchase that represent children of all color. I think that's really great, and I think that that would help us and our families explore what it really means to look and talk and engage with the conversation of color, of race. Okay, so I highly recommend that one. Okay, so here we go. I also want to encourage you to think about books that don't necessarily talk about race, but that just have pictures of people of color in them. So, In God's Name, it is by Sandy Eisenberg Sasso. It's gorgeous, illustrated by Phoebe Stone, In God's Name. So it talks about the different pictures of who God is. This was one of my very favorites. Let's see if I can find the page. Here we go. So the mother and the father and the children of color. It's beautiful, and it tells a great story of who God is. All right, another book is Because Nothing Looks Like God. This is by Lawrence Kushner and Karen Kushner, and I really recommend it. It's got great conversations about who God is, about families that all look different. Okay, and then 2 children's Bibles that I think are great, just because we all ought to have those around. You know, I think about when I purchase Bibles at church for our children, and if Jesus looks just like me, I have a hard time with it, because I'm pretty sure that Jesus was from the Middle East. And so we need to make sure that Jesus doesn't look exactly like us, and that we don't make Jesus into us. So I know that's an odd thing to say, but I think it's important that Jesus doesn't have to look just like us for us to know him and worship him and follow him. All right, so we've got Children of God Storybook Bible. The Archbishop Desmond Tutu is the author, and it's got so many different illustrators. Each picture looks very different because they've gotten different illustrators from around the world. Okay, and the same for the Shine On a Story Bible. Different illustrators. Different illustrators throughout the whole thing. So I encourage you to, yes, get some books that are very intentional about discrimination and racism, but also get some books just where color and children and people of color are normative in your home. All right, the last thing that I want to share with you is a YouTube video from the Tutu teacher. She's a kindergarten teacher in New York, and she makes videos. And so one of her videos is Let's Talk About Race. And she reads a beautiful story about talking about race. And I encourage you to check it out and to enjoy it with your children. Okay, last thing I want to share. Our series is over, but the conversation doesn't need to be over. In fact, it actually needs to continue. And so I welcome you to talk to me, to ask me questions. I don't have all the answers, but I would love for us to work on finding the answers together, because in seeking the answers, we are seeking the truth of who God calls us to be. And we are helping invite our children into that conversation. And inviting our children into the conversation is helping them be followers of Jesus as well. So I've enjoyed our time together, but I do welcome your comments, your conversation, your questions, so that we can continue this conversation and we can continue the work of better parenting together.